Good morning. I am here with a few spare minutes. I wanted to do a quick introductory video on a certain topic. I'll be bringing that up in just a second. But it will be a topic that we will probably, over time, go through a series of videos to really explore. It's quite an intricate topic once you get into it, but I wanted to at least give you some of the basics so that we have a starting point today. By the way, my name is Jeff Corinter from Arcanum Holistic Clinic, and I've been doing this series of videos on taking the deeper philosophy from Heilkunst medicine and bringing that out into how that applies to life as a whole or life in general. So I'll do what I've been doing. I have my little notepad here. Let me just bring up my screen and let's just dive right into it. As I say, I will be running out of time in a few minutes, but I thought I can lay down a really good baseline of some concepts here. So let me find my screen here. Yeah, so we are going to be talking about the philosophy of language in a very particular way. And to open up the discussion, let me actually read the very first sentence of a book I've been studying for a while. This is, let me see if I can show you the cover here. The cover of the book is called, oops, that's the wrong button. Yeah, the cover is called The Logos Structure of the World, Language as Model of Reality. That's by the author Georg Kuhlevent. And let me just go back to my location here. Okay, so the very first sentence, I'm not going to read the whole book, just the first sentence. This book aims to show that the world, including human beings and their consciousness, is not originally a world of things, but a world of words, that fundamentally it is structured like a text and can therefore be read like a text. So that is definitely a provocative statement. Let me just go to back to my notes here. And yeah, as I say, that's the more we dive into this can become quite an intricate and complex topic. We will get to various points on this topic in future videos. As I say, I just want to lay out more of a baseline here. So as Kuhlevent said in that opening statement I read, he's really taking us out of the dominant paradigm of our modern world, and it's a very material paradigm, right? We, in terms of our science and how that filters into culture, how we look at ourselves, how we look at medicine, how we look at all kinds of things in our life, we really have adopted this dominant worldview of materialism. And in this very first sentence I read from the Kuhlevent book, he's turning that right upside down. He's essentially saying, no, this is not a material world, fundamentally, a world of particles and matter and things like that. But he's saying it's a world of words or a world of language, a world of concepts. If you have some background in the Western philosophical tradition, we could say that this is kind of pointing to the philosophy of idealism, although we're going to take a slightly different turn from that. But the main point here is that this is not a world of matter and particles, as Kuhlevent is laying out in this book, but we really have a much better foundation if we start in this world of ideas, language, or concepts. So that's just, as I say, a kind of a provocative opening statement, but it really takes us into the kind of philosophy we really want to start exploring in a more complex or complete way. So to start, as I always have been doing in these videos, with a basic example from Heilkunst medicine, just of course it's a big reference point for me, but I think it's a very clear example. And then from there, we'll start to extrapolate that into everyday life, or how you can apply that to your life in general. So the medical example I want to give from Heilkunst, and this is my everyday bread and butter, when I'm seeing patients and we're dealing with whatever their health situation is, whatever the medical situation is, we have to come to the very fundamental question of diagnosis. And this is kind of the big thing that separates Heilkunst medicine from allopathic medicine. And as I have on my little notes here, I wrote down, the difference between a false condition label versus a true diagnosis. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if you go to your allopathic doctor, you're going to get some kind of label like a depression or arthritis, or, we know all the labels, right? Those are everywhere. We either got them ourselves or our friends or family have got them. We know all those labels, but as soon as you come into Heilkunst diagnosis, we may start with that. Somebody says, "Oh, my doctor says I have X, Y, or Z." They have a certain label, but the whole process of Heilkunst is we want to get down into the true diagnosis. So, the way I would say that is you may have, let's say we have 20 different patients in a given month with migraines. That's a false condition label, but each one of those 20 people, from our point of view, is going to have a unique and different true diagnosis, or, the way we give the Heilkunst diagnosis. We're not going to stop at that simple word of migraines, or whatever the example is. We're going to find out for that individual what that true diagnosis is. And just to, as I say, we can have a whole long video just on this, but I just want to use this as our opening example, and I want to move more into the more general philosophy here. But in that example, let's say someone with the migraine, let's say one given patient, the diagnosis that we come up with is going to be, let's say, the homeopathic remedy belladonna. I'm totally making up a case here, or an example here, but let's say this one patient needs that remedy belladonna. That's their diagnosis, versus another patient, maybe their migraines are going to be cured by the homeopathic remedy lachesis. So two very different remedies, two very different states of being and states of a migraine. And we've, in this case now, from two of our 20 patients, already we have two very different diagnoses. So anyways, my point here is not so much to talk about medicine, I'm just using this as an example, but really to get into this philosophy of language where, in the first case, in the allopathic label, where we had the word migraine, as I'm calling that a false condition label, that is not really getting to the heart of what's really going on with this one patient versus that other patient, versus all the 20 patients we may see with a migraine in this month. They may all each get a very different diagnosis, 20 different diagnoses. But what I'm really starting to get at here is this difference in how we understand language, how we use language, and whether language is being used in a way which gets into a more fundamental part of reality, or if it's more of kind of an abstract kind of a disconnected way of using language. So let me kind of unfold that a little bit. If, again, if you have a little bit of a background in the Western philosophical tradition, you may have come across the concept of nominalism. And what that concept simply means, what it says about language is that basically, back to our material worldview, the nominalistic concept basically says that there's no direct or meaningful connection between language and reality, because in the material worldview, reality is defined as material things. If you have a bunch of atoms and molecules, and even if they all join together, okay, now we supposedly have a life form made up of all those atoms and molecules. But whatever you call that, oh, I call this a frog, or I call that a tree, or, we have names for all these things in nature. But in the nominalistic concept, those names are merely labels. They don't really give you anything other than a word that you can, speak to somebody else and kind of a communicative way. Like, instead of just pointing at things, we can kind of have words that take the place of pointing. But as I say, in this nominalistic worldview, as part of the materialistic worldview, it doesn't give us anything real. It doesn't add anything. It doesn't give us like the fundamental part of reality. Like in the example I gave, if we're talking about a diagnosis, it doesn't give us a diagnosis that's actually going to help the person. It may leave somebody stuck in their label, but it doesn't give us anything through which we can actually cure that disease, or cure their health issue. So rather than nominalism, the whole basis of Heilkunst diagnosis comes more from a concept that we would call disclosure. So rather than just slapping a label onto reality, we are actually using language in a way, like when I said earlier, someone had a migraine, that needed, through our diagnosis, they may have needed a belladonna remedy. Well, that's more of a disclosive use of language where it actually gives us something that we can now not only, just name, give a name to something, but we can actually do something with that. We can give the right remedy, and that's going to be curative. So this is what I'm talking about here. This concept of disclosure, it brings out from the depths of reality what actually, what are actually the generative creative forces which brought that particular state of migraine out in that person. So this is where I say, where we have the true diagnosis, this has brought that word, the diagnostic word, the prescription in this case, in the Heilkunst case, gives us now the disclosure for what it is that will actually move the person forward. It will get rid of the migraine, it'll improve their health, all the good things that we do with medicine. But my bigger point here is it's a different way of using language. So now we have the difference between nominalism as one way of using language and disclosure as a very different way of using language. And these different ways of language, as I said at the beginning when I read that Kuhlevin quote, that comes from fundamentally, it comes from a very different worldview. If you have a material worldview, you can't really go much further than nominalism, just making up words and making up labels for things, which doesn't really add anything. It just, at best, it kind of gives us a way of speaking about things rather than, kind of mutely pointing at things. So nominalism, disclosure. And to go back to, I believe, the last video where we were talking about the whole process of thinking, and we were talking a little bit about this another aspect of what we're talking about today. This is kind of a redo of one of the note slides I had last time, and that is where this powerful function of thinking is really what kind of joins up, within this deeper process of really being part of the world and being conscious and everything. Through our function of thinking, we join our perceptual world, or percepts, with the deeper world of concepts, or as I wrote here, universal concepts. Because as I said, in the nominalism slide, the use of language is just simply slapping a word or a concept onto reality. But in fact, what thinking is doing and what language is doing is it's drawing out what constitutes reality in the first place. It's not atoms and particles, as I said, but it's words and concepts, as we read from that Kuhlevin book at the beginning. So anyways, this process of language, which is joined with this process of thinking, is really what brings out the depths of reality, what's actually true and what's actually real. We're bringing it out by activating this process of thinking and this process of language. So the joining of the percepts and the concepts, as I say, this is really what language is drawing out and really bringing into our understanding of what actually is real versus what we're just in the nominalistic world, we're just kind of, wandering around and not really knowing what's what. We're just, as I say, we're just kind of stuck in our supposed abstract worlds, but not getting to this. So if you go back to our last week's video, there's kind of more of an expanded version of this slide here. But on our point of language, I wanted to bring this back in because this is really where we get into the power of language. And another word that I've used today is the word generative. And this is, when we get into this disclosive aspect of language, which taps us into this deeper reality of nature, it also is this other very important Heilkunst word that we use, which is generative. And that is, everything about our physiology, everything about our mind, even our organ functions, our mental functions, the whole way that everything from digesting our food to how we create our thinking, how we create our concepts, or find the concepts of whatever it is we're observing. This is a very generative process. So the fact that we go out in the world and we walk around and we see things, we experience things, we have thoughts about things. When we're alive and very active in this dynamic process, this is actually a very generative process. So you could say, when we go for our walk out in the world and we walk by trees and people and other things or whatever, we're actually in a constant process in our own consciousness of really generating this whole world that we take part in. And the fact that it's generative means that we ourselves are a very living, active part of it. We're not just some passive observers who happen to see this thing or that, this tree or this other thing one day, but we are in our consciousness, we are actually very dynamically involved in the world. And in terms of what happens around us, what happens to us, what happens near us, all of this is part of our uniquely individual generative capacity to be part of the world and be part of nature and the things that are happening around us. So to draw back on our example of diagnosis, when I was starting with the medical Heilkunst example, this the true diagnosis, as I'm calling it, is this is why it actually becomes a curative process. Why the Heilkunst remedies that we give are actually curative for the patient, and the prescription that we're giving is directly tying back into wherever that disease came from in the patient. Our process is kind of like a reverse engineering the process of our prescription and our diagnosis. Our generative activity is actually reaching into the precise thing that that generated that disease in the patient in the first place, versus when where we started with the allopathic medicine, that kind of nominalistic labeling process, which is not really a diagnosis. It's not really reaching into what the source of that disease is. It's just, as I say, just slapping that label on, and it's not really getting us anywhere. Well, at best, it's not getting us anywhere, but at worst, it's actually suppressive. This is why we have side effects from allopathic medicine and other problems that come out of it. So anyways, because of getting into this disclosive or true use of language, we're actually doing something very productive, because it's actually tapping into more of the deeper, the true reality of where things have come from in our health and in our diseases, rather than, as I say, just using language in a nominalistic, abstract way. And a more general way of saying that, not just in the health sciences, but all sciences in general, what we call the inorganic sciences, like chemistry and physics, what we would say is rocket science, the way we build rockets and go off to the moon. All of that is inorganic science, and that's a valid science. It's just a way of finding, what are all the non-living parts of the world, the minerals and the rocks and all the non-living elements. We understand that through physics, excuse me, and this inorganic science, and we could do things, as I said, like build a rocket and go to the moon. So that's wonderful. But from our healthcare perspective, we have to go beyond simply or inorganic science, and we have to get into true organic science, or the life sciences. So that's everything I've said about Heilkunst and disclosive language and diagnosis. Yeah, in that organic science, the only way you can be successful is if you go deeper into that language of disclosure, or that, as I say, that very dynamic part of living, and that dynamic part of using language. So the final point I'll kind of end on is, and this is very powerful, the more you really kind of grasp what's going on with this concept. And we've kind of been getting hints of this in what I've been saying, but the quote I wrote down here is, language gives the world to us. Like I said earlier with nominalism, we don't give language to the world, just because I call something a tree or a frog or whatever. That's not what makes up the world. It's the fact that when, if we imagine back to when we first learned how to speak when we were babies, the fact that we first started learning words wasn't this nominalistic process of slapping those words onto reality, but in fact, the fact that we started to get those words were pointing to this much deeper reality of, this deeper language basis of the world, and it was starting to wake up in us as we learned our first words. So when we have babies and they start saying their first words, remember that they're not just nominalistically learning how to put words onto reality, but it's a tremendous awakening to this fact that language is really constitutes reality and really generates it. Really, really, we come to discover that. We don't just come to invent that or slap that on. So if you've ever read Helen Keller's biography, there's an amazing example of this. You know, the first time she started learning language, like sign language, and how this really revealed this great world which she can never have even imagined before. So it wasn't that she was in the world just wondering what to call things, but by learning those first words of her sign language was this very powerful powerful revelatory or disclosive process that she went through. If you've never read that, it's worth looking up on the internet. You can find that passage from her biography. And anyways, I'm going to leave the video here. We're going to carry on in the next video, go deeper into this, but I just wanted to lay this baseline down, and we'll come back to these basic concepts again and again. Thank you again for joining me today, and I look forward to going even deeper into this in our future discussions.